Und darum müssen Sie verstehen, Sie haben eine Macht, weil was Ihre Meinung ist, das entscheiden nur Sie. Okay? Sie haben eine riesengroße Macht. Manchmal ist es eine Ohnmacht, ja. Sie dann nicht wissen, wie soll ich mir eine Meinung bilden, wenn so viele verschiedene Dinge erzählt werden. Aber das ist das Spannende an den heutigen Zeiten.
20 Jahre sind vergangen seit den Terroranschlägen vom 11. September. Die Frage, die für mich im Raum steht, ist, wurden wir ehrlich und sachlich informiert über diesen Terroranschlag?
And as historian, we go back to the data. We know it's very delicate data, and we have to find out what really happened on that day. So the first thing we do is, how many towers did go down in New York? And what we now know is that the third tower, World Trade Center 7, also went down on the same day, but it was not hit by a plane. Okay? So we have 3 towers that go down, but we only have 2 planes.
And then, obviously, we've been talking about the media for a long time. Then you have to keep in mind that people know about 9/11 because they watch television.
9/11 ist ein Medienereignis, in erster Linie ein TV-Ereignis. Die Leute haben es am Fernsehen gesehen. Und darum glauben sie, es sind 2 Türme, weil man das immer gesehen hat. Und da habe ich die ganzen Fernsehstationen nochmal abgegrast und geschaut, wie wurde das in der Schweiz berichtet, wie wurde es in Deutschland berichtet. Eigentlich 2 Türme. Fast überall haben sie 2 Türme. Und in England haben sie aber BBC, die berichten über 3 Türme. Und ich habe mich dann entschieden, die Fakten nochmal zu prüfen. Ich bin nochmal hingegangen und habe mich gefragt, ist das Gebäude sicher zusammengefallen? Und die Antwort ist ja. Und die zweite Frage, ist da kein Flugzeug reingeflogen? Und die Antwort ist ja. Es ist eine Beleidigung für den Verstand. Also 9/11 hat verschiedene Beleidigungen, aber eine ist an den Verstand. Und das ist unglaublich. Ich habe ja eigentlich viel Medienarbeit gemacht, auch zum Thema 9/11. Und wie man da auch angegriffen wird, wenn man nur Fragen stellt. Warum haben die Medien darüber nicht ausführlicher berichtet? Ja? Ich habe dann gedacht, ja gut, ich gehe mal die verschiedenen TV-Stationen durch und es ist einfach nirgends gekommen, außer bei BBC World. Und da habe ich mich gefreut und gedacht, ja, BBC World hat darüber berichtet, Jane Stanley ist die Journalistin, aber die haben zu früh berichtet. Ja, ist so. Die haben um 5 Uhr berichtet und das Gebäude fiel um 20 nach 5. Erst 2008, die Medien sind ja blitzschnell, hat sich dann Richard Porter entschuldigt, das ist der Chef von BBC World News. Er hat gesagt, we were working on an incorrect news agency report. Das heißt so viel wie sorry. Und dann, we had this statement von Reuters. Wir hatten diese Aussage von Reuters. Das heißt, wir können auch nichts dafür. Reuters hat das eingespielt in das Informationssystem. Und Jane Stanley kann sicher nichts dafür. Sie war einfach die Journalistin vor Ort, sie hat von einem Teleprompter abgelesen und sie sagt, it was a mistake, I was thrown, not a question, but a statement of fact, I don't know where it came from. Das heißt, sie hat es einfach vorgelesen.
So back in Switzerland, this all left me very confused. Okay, I was looking at the data and was going, what do we hear on Swiss television? On Swiss television, we just hear 2 towers collapsed. We didn't hear anything about the 3rd tower. Nothing. And then, it said, now the war on terrorism started and, America attacked Afghanistan. Why? Okay, because bin Laden is there. It's very confusing, isn't it? And then I checked different TV stations and I checked the BBC. Because the BBC, is a very respected TV station. Many people say it's the best TV station in the world. So I checked, did they report the collapse of the 3rd tower? And the good news is, yes, they did. But the bad news is, too early, okay? They reported, yeah, you're laughing, but it's not a detail for me. They reported the collapse at 5 o'clock, but the building collapsed at 5:20. And that's not good, okay? You should not report something before it happened. That's really bizarre, this whole 9/11 thing. Once you dig deep, it becomes very strange. Jane Stanley was the journalist. She was standing in front, and she said, at the 5 o'clock news, she said the 47-story Salomon Brothers building close to the World Trade Center has also collapsed. The Salomon Brothers building is World Trade Center 7. But at that time, the building is standing behind her. So that's fake news. And in 2008, she had to take a stand, okay? And she said, it was a mistake. She said, I was thrown, not a question, but a statement of fact. I don't know where that came from. So really what she does is she's reading out from a teleprompter. Okay, so I know how journalists work. She didn't do the research, she was just there doing live reporting, meaning reading out of a prompter. So the question is, how did it end up on that prompter? How did these people know? And then Richard Porter, the head of BBC World News, says, we were working on an incorrect news agency report. We had the statement from Reuters. Okay, that doesn't make it much better, because Reuters is one of the biggest news agencies of the world. If they get it wrong, something is seriously wrong. That came out in 2008, so BBC had to apologize. Most people at the time were not interested in 9/11 anymore. Only historians like me, we go through the details and say, okay, Jane Stanley, how is she doing today? Let's search for her. What is she doing? So this 9/11 story is complicated. I just, want to give it to you that if you reflect upon 9/11 at all, focus on World Trade Center 7, and there focus on the question whether it's been destroyed by fire or by controlled demolition.
Das ist Stahl-Skelettbau. Das bricht nicht einfach weg, weil ein Hund dran pinkelt.
Weil wenn das Gebäude gesprengt wurde, müssen wir darüber sprechen, weil der ganze Afghanistan-Krieg mit mehr als 200.000 Toten, der Irakkrieg mit vermutlich mehr als 1 Million Tote hängt daran.
BBC, Jane Stanley hat darüber berichtet und dann habe ich herausgefunden, die hat zu früh berichtet. Ich kann mir nicht vorstellen, warum man über den Einsturz von WTC 7 berichtet, wenn es noch steht. Und da muss man die Redaktion, Richard Porter, und der hat gesagt, wir haben hier einen falschen Bericht einer Nachrichtenagentur. Wir hatten diese Aussage von Reuters. Ja gut, dann sind Sie bei Reuters. Das ist eine der größten Nachrichtenagenturen. Das heißt, wir werden heute gesteuert durch Leitmedien und Nachrichtenagenturen. Und wenn die wollen, dass Sie etwas so sehen, wie Sie entschieden haben, dann sehen Sie das so. Und da müsste eigentlich BBC wirklich überlegen und sagen, okay, ja, tut uns leid, es ist einfach Fake News. Aber das schaffen die nicht. Wir leben in einem Zeitalter von Fake News und völliger Verwirrung.
Hallo, schön, dass Sie da sind. In den Episoden 1 und 2 haben wir gesehen, wie die Fernsehzuschauer in Deutschland, in der Schweiz, in Frankreich und im Vereinigten Königreich informiert wurden. In diesem Video geht es um das Auslandsprogramm der BBC, BBC World.
The Cardinals lead to 7-0. The final run of the game came off a wild.
And we're getting reports of a plane crash in the World Trade Center in New York. You can see the pictures there. It's one of New York's tallest buildings. That's all the information we know at the moment, but as you can see, it is a considerable collision and there is a large fire. That's all the information we have at the moment, but we'll be back with more details in just a short while at the top of the hour. Joining us now on the phone from New York is Steve Evans, who was, I believe, in the building at the time. Steve, what can you tell us about what happened this morning?
People are running away very, very quickly. There are more explosions further down the building. It was calm until we came on the air now, but I'm now looking up at this building, and there is smoke billowing from the very top, but then there is a fire and an explosion about 20 stories further down. I was at the base of the building when it happened. There was one huge bang, and the building physically shook. Then another 2 or 3 bangs, and the building again shook, and people came screaming past me.
At the moment, it looks as if both buildings are on fire.
Clearly, the thing is out of control. As I say, there is smoke billowing out from further and further down the building, and people are simply moving back. They don't know what has happened. Initially, the assumption was that it was a bomb. People have been coming past me now saying, no, it was an aircraft which hit the building. More than that, I cannot say, apart from to tell you that people here are very, very frightened. People are crying, people are shaking. They've stopped running away from the building. They are now walking away. There is moisture raining down from a clear sky. I only presume that comes from the disaster which is going on above me as I speak.
It must be a very busy scene, Steve. Are there a lot of people there?
Well, there are a lot of people. The man whose phone it is asking me, he's evacuating the shop, and I have to get off, I'm afraid, because he wants his phone back, and we have to leave. I'll stay with it here. There are people who are very, very frightened. Clearly, This is a very high, it is one of the tallest buildings in the world. There is an uncontrollable event involving explosions and fire going on above us. People simply don't know what's happening. An awful lot of people are just getting as far away as they possibly can.
Steve Evans, thank you for joining us from the World Trade Center. So clearly chaos there. Joining us now is our New York correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what can you tell us?
Well, there's of course huge speculation here about what has happened. The two towers of the World Trade Center, those two famous towers, both on fire. We do know that about 9 minutes before the top of the hour, a first plane appeared to crash into the upper floors of one of the towers, and then within about 18 minutes later, a second plane or a second explosion happened. But there's of course huge speculation already about how on earth this could happen.
In 1993, of course, there was a major bomb explosion. It must bring back horrible memories of that.
Of course it does, and that's why people are thinking, how on earth could this have happened already? Some commentators are speculating that there was some form of missile involved. Of course, there's no confirmation at all of anything like that. People are talking, was it a deliberate navigational error? Of course, this all refers back to the February 1993 bombing of the World Trade Towers, in which 6 people were killed and more than 1,000 people were injured, and that, of course, a terrorist attack.
Any word of fatalities or injuries, Jane?
Not at all, but obviously this is going to be quite a serious number of injuries. We don't know what planes were traveling, how many people were on them, if any, of course, apart from a pilot. There's really no information at all. People here in New York just glued to live pictures unfolding on the television screens. These towers, just a symbol of New York, and amazing pictures of course, the plane going through almost one of the towers, and just this massive explosion.
Jane, the time of day for this attack, would it have been as office workers were starting their day, or too early for that?
It would have caught quite a number of office workers. The Port Authority headquarters, a big public service agency in New York, of course, in one of those twin towers. And also New York's commuter airports, very, very busy around that time of day, people going to Washington, to Boston, flying out of the city. So with no information at the moment, nobody's got any idea of how many people could have been hurt or injured or killed.
Have the authorities said whether any kind of warning was received about this kind of possible attack?
Certainly that is not on the agenda at the moment. Nobody's talking of any kind of warning. But it must be said that people in New York have been quite conscious that since the American embassy bombers were sentenced here, and one is due still to be sentenced this week, that there could be some kind of revenge involvement, of course, because of this 1993 attack.
Of course, at this stage it is speculation as to who or what might be behind this attack. But tell us, Jane, at this stage, what kind of reaction are we getting from eyewitnesses as to what exactly happened?
Well, there's some confusion, you know, people talking about possibly some kind of missile. Was it one plane? Was it two? But, of course, we know those bare details of the second plane or the second object going through and exploding the second tower. But eyewitnesses we haven't heard much from yet. I think there will be shock and disbelief. I mean, it's like a scene from a film almost. It doesn't seem to be real to New Yorkers who I can see just glued to their television screens.
Jane, we're just going to remind viewers of what we're looking at the moment and run pictures that we've got of a second plane which flew directly into the World Trade Center in New York, causing an enormous explosion. Earlier, another plane had flown into the second block of the World Trade Center. This took place at about 9 a.m. New York time, just as office workers would have been gathering for the start of their day. Jane, why is it that the World Trade Center has proved to be such a target for these kind of attacks?
Well, we don't know if this is an attack at all, though the pictures of that second plane heading right towards the tower will, of course, raise suspicions. This is very, very early days, but it could be a navigational error as well. We really don't know. These are all the things that are being talked about at these very early stages. But those towers, like buildings like the Empire State Building, they say New York, and they say also New York's financial dominance and America's financial dominance. So perhaps that will turn out to be a clue as the investigation, which will have to follow this, of course, comes up with something.
We're looking at pictures of the World Trade Center ablaze in New York, the result of two planes which went into the side of the World Trade Centers in the upper stories. It's not clear at the moment whether this was deliberate, though that is the suspicion. Tell us a bit more about the attack on the World Trade Center in 1993 and who was found guilty for that, Jane.
Hello, hello.
I think we've... Ash Rajan, an eyewitness to the attack, joins us now. Ash, what did you see? What can you tell us about what's going on?
Well, I just got off the train right in the belly of the World Trade Center, the train that was getting me in from home this morning.
That's an internal national decision by the Israelis, although no one knows who is responsible for what has happened in the last 4 hours. Let's now go live to New York City, where our correspondent Jane Stanley now joins me. Jane, we can see behind you those plumes of smoke still rising from the World Trade Center, what's left of it. Describe the mood and the atmosphere and what you can see there.
Well, as you can see, that is indeed where the World Trade Center was. I think many Americans here, New Yorkers, just cannot believe that when that plume of smoke goes, that landmark will not be there. And of course, the 50,000 people who worked in that building every day, we don't know their fate yet. Up and down behind me, you can see ambulances coming, frequently taking victims, injured. We don't know. There's almost a total news blackout. This part of the city is completely closed. But we do know the hospitals are taking in people with very severe burns and injuries from the debris that fell from around the World Trade Center with the initial planes colliding with the buildings. Of course, the area around the World Trade Center was evacuated when the towers themselves collapsed. But there's very much here a sense of not real panic, but of people wanting to get out of the city if they can. I saw huge streams of people walking uptown as far away as possible, and people coming out of buildings, people just almost totally evacuating the high-rise buildings. The Empire State, for example, nearby was also totally evacuated. So crowds of people on the pavement and wondering what on earth has happened, how can this have happened as well.
Now, Jane, Rudy Giuliani, the mayor, has taken a very tough stand. He's evacuated the whole of the area. What else is coming out of City Hall?
Very little, apart from he is talking of tremendous numbers of casualties, talking in the thousands, because of course we have no confirmed death or injured figures. There's actually too much chaos here. For example, the main cellular telephone connections were on top of the World Trade Center, so people can't get through to each other. That's very sad and just horrific for people who are looking for loved ones. I mean, I've seen people crying in the street, desperately bashing their cell phones, trying to get through to family members and trying to see where they are. So it's in this chaos, because of a scale of a tragedy of an attack like this, there is very, very little firm information.
Jane, are you getting a sense really that almost a way of life has begun to seize up in parts of New York City and beyond into the state? Because of course many of those working down in Wall Street would have commuted in.
Totally, and this is something that is going to continue and get worse during the day. I mean, for example, Wall Street and the whole financial area and the whole downtown area is closed. Trading has been suspended on the New York Stock Exchange. And I know, because I live further uptown in New York, I'm going to be having to put people up in my apartment tonight because they won't be able to get down there to, it's most likely, to actually go home. People who need to get across the bridges and tunnels, people who would have perhaps been flying home after working here during the day or over the weekend, they can't get anywhere. The airports are closed. is a city that is sealed in a way in this dreadful event.
And what can one imagine about the way of life? In other words, the basics of life like sanitation, water and so on, because you are talking about an enormous area down there and people who have to service it all.
No, it is a huge area, and you can't imagine how long this is going to take to put together. I mean, 50,000 people alone work in the World Trade Center, or did until today. How many people work in that huge busy area? Those pavements would have been crowded with people when this accident, this attack happened. So trying to restore the services from this kind of damage is going to be huge. It's going to take a long time for New York to recover physically with its cell phones, its sanitation, like you said, but I think emotionally for New York to recover and for Americans to recover. They're worried about an attack like this, but it never seemed real that something like this could develop and they could watch it happening on their television screens, as is what happened today.
Well, Jane Stanley, thanks for joining us live from South Manhattan. You can see in the background behind Jane there what's left of the World Trade Center, the smoke, the dust, the rubble burning. And well, let's now go to New York City, where about 5.5 hours ago the horror began unfolding with this incident when a second plane flew in to the second of the World Trade Center towers. A first plane already having flown into the right hand of the towers. You can see there the damage and the smoke already billowing out. Well, let's now go live to New York City, to that location, to Jane Stanley, who's on the corner of 6th Avenue and Grand. Jane, we can see the smoke and the rubble and everything else behind you in the distance. What is happening now in South Manhattan?
Well, South Manhattan down here, just behind me, is effectively closed. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani made that announcement. He said that the downtown area of the city was closed, was to be evacuated. And to be honest, people were very, very willing to get out of it. I saw, as I was coming down here, people just walking the pavements full, just trying to get as far away as possible. Though, of course, at some point later in the day, they're going to have to try to get home for the evening, and that's going to be incredibly difficult because this whole downtown area is the hub of many subway lines going into Brooklyn, into Queens. It's like a city that's completely in chaos, completely disrupted, doesn't know where it's at.
Now, the National Guard has already been mobilized by Rudy Giuliani, the mayor. What are the other implications for this enormous city, particularly the fact that the financial heart in Wall Street has essentially been ripped apart by these two explosions?
The implications are huge. This was the busiest area of Manhattan. 50,000 people, as we know, worked in the World Trade Center alone. Tens of thousands more in the areas around that. The Empire State Building, which is just behind me on this side, another huge building, has been evacuated. People, the whole area almost ground to a halt. You can probably hear yet another one of a stream of emergency vehicles, that one an ambulance constantly ferrying away from the area. It's an emergency scene. There's nothing else happening there, and I can't see much recovery very quickly. The damage here is enormous.
Jane, let's talk about the human side. You live in New York with our BBC colleagues. You're one of, what, 10 or 11 million people. What about the people around you you've seen who don't have a house at the moment, don't have anywhere to work, don't know what they're going to do? What's the state of shock?
It's awful.
Well, that's symptomatic of the communications difficulties we have with New York City, because many of the communication systems are actually connected via scanners and transmitters and receivers up on the top of the World Trade Center, including all the mobile phone systems.
But I want, first of all, to go to the BBC's New York business correspondent, Paddy O'Connell, who was there today. Where were you when this happened, Paddy?
Personally, I was in the subway. There's an economic conference on at the World Trade Center that we were attending. In a moment, more from my colleague Steve Evans, who you saw briefly there, who was in the Trade Center when it happened. I was on the subway and my whole morning was spent with people trying to get away from the scene.
Did you hear anything at the time? Did you know anything was happening?
Yes, it was just as the skyline has been altered, it became clear that this is a city whose lifestyle is being altered as we speak. The transportation system ground to a halt. phone calls were useless. You couldn't use cell phones. I went into a shop to try and use their phone. There was a line of people trying to use it. Then the line went dead. Then, as the whole impression of what had happened spread by word of mouth at this stage, street by street, as you headed north away from the World Trade Center, the streets were shut down. Therefore, more and more people were hearing by mouth and then gathering behind me in Times Square. In the conventional New York through history, the way to learn news, although this time about an attack on their own city and elsewhere. And we'll bring you in a moment, David, some of what they were telling us. But first, the full impact was seen in the moment in time. My colleague Stephen Evans, who was in the Trade Center and was interviewed just after the first explosion.
There was another big explosion in the other tower. Flames coming out in this billowing grey smoke. People still not panicking, people not quite understanding what was going on. Then somebody said that they saw an airliner go into one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. The thing that strikes me is, one, the terribleness of the incident, whatever the cause, and we don't go into politics, but whatever the cause, the terribleness, the hugeness of what's happened. So huge, in fact, that most of the people around simply can't understand what happened. People were just standing around, talking to each other, nodding their heads. Oh my God! We gotta go! We gotta go! We gotta go!
Oh my God! These pictures then of the immediate aftermath. David, behind me in Times Square, phalanxes of people all day, tourists and people headed north, remember, trying to get away, to get home, and at the moment they're stranded. They were speaking to us, giving their reaction on what had happened in their city.
I'm glad to be alive. I mean, there was a total stampede of people. I fell a couple of times, got, slightly trampled, but I walked away with just a scratched knee. So I'm just trying to get home right now to be with my family.
Were you working downtown? Is that what?
Yes, I work on Wall Street, 14 Wall Street, and the devastation is unbelievable. And I'm quite sure that the loss of life is enormous.
It's a very densely packed area down there. Were you with people you knew? Did you lose people at the moment you can't find? Get in touch with?
Currently, right now, there is a friend of mine that worked in the second tower, and I tried to call her this morning when I heard about the first plane crashing into the building, and I have not been able to reach her.
We still don't know the magnitude of it, and it's just horrible.
Do you live and work in the city?
I work in the city.
What's your day been like?
Chaotic. Everyone fleeing from downtown, getting as far away from the chaos as possible, and not knowing what's going to happen next. Just horrible.
Where did you go first? Where were you when it happened?
I was in Midtown, and I walked towards Central Park with hundreds of other people, just going away from the chaos of Wall Street.
We're in shock. I mean, the enormity of it and the significance of it hasn't filtered through yet, I don't think. But everyone's walking along. I mean, I walked up from 25th Street, up Broadway, and people are walking around in shock, literally.
Do you think it's going to be long for that to turn to anger among people?
No, I don't, actually. I think that reaction will happen pretty quickly.
It's just like Pearl Harbor. This is like an act of war. And I think that whatever retribution they can, I'm eye for an eye, and all that, but something's got to be done. We can't live like this. This is the capital of the world. More business is done here between 60th Street and downtown Manhattan than any place else in the world. The whole world is responsible for this area here.
I checked on every single person I know. The co-worker I work with, she was very distressed. Her boyfriend she works on the 92nd floor, and she hasn't heard from him ever since. And we've been talking for like about 4 hours, trying to get in contact, and she hasn't heard from him. So other than that, my family's good, but I don't know how she's going to do.
It's unbelievable. Got to work, I thought it was a normal, every other kind of day, and then everything changed. My life will never be the same, even though I had nobody, personally involved in what's happened today. I don't think things can ever go back to the way they were. So I'm...
Stephen Evans, we're hearing there people saying things will never be the same and talking about the sense of shock. How do you think things will change for New York?
It's very difficult to say. That thing happened, what is it, something like
7 hours ago, and it's still not real to me. It simply isn't real. People were wandering away, not being able to believe what had happened. You do change in strange ways. If you see people looking up into the sky, you suddenly get a frisson of fear. So that kind of fear is rippling through all those people who are there. And remember, 50,000 people work in those buildings. It was something like 9:15 in the morning. In the commercial capital of the world, you don't get times more busy than that. So I think an awful lot of people would have gone away from that thing and simply thought and ruminated about it. And that sort of shock takes time to come to you and then to get over it.
And is there any news about the number of dead, or indeed whether there are people injured and being taken out of the rubble of those towers that collapsed?
Not news that I've got. Obviously, you've just got to look at those pictures and realize that something very major has happened. One of the things that struck me was that people didn't move away immediately. People moved, if you like, I don't know, 100 meters away, but there were then explosions later. I noticed about an hour later, for example, in the street where I was, there were about 100 ambulances queuing up to get into the building. The emergency services were thick on the ground very, very quickly. But there was that second explosion and the collapse of the building. I'm not sure that the emergency services quite realized what was about to happen. There was a cloud of smoke. I don't quite know what the impact of that would have been.
And what was the...
You don't imagine that an airliner is going to crash into a building like that. Nobody quite knew what the engineering implications were. My suspicion is that there were casualties way after the initial impact.
And what was the mood actually in the street? We saw you as that building collapsed. Did people panic after that, or were they just aghast and standing watching?
It was genuinely very impressive. Clearly people were panicking, people were shocked, and you could see tears in their eyes and you could hear the shaking in their voices. But I didn't hear many people screaming, and I didn't hear anybody clambering to get over anybody else, if you like. I was evacuated from a hotel about 200 meters from the thing about an hour after the initial blast. There was a disabled lady trying to get downstairs. She was being very, very slow, and people were saying, hold on a minute, I'll help you down. So there was something uplifting, really, in the aftermath of all that.
Steve, thanks very much. We may have a chance to talk to you later about some of the other implications and the implications on the American economy, the world economy of what happened. But I'm joined now by Professor Galea, who's an expert in fire safety. Jane, thanks very much. Let's join Jane Stanley now, who's in New York this afternoon. Jane, good afternoon. We can see the smoke still billowing out behind you. Has the mood changed in New York in these 7 hours?
I don't think it has really. It went from a very early disbelief as these events unfolded live on American television screens. People saying, oh, this is like a movie, I couldn't believe that this would happen. And I think then to utter horror as the Twin Towers collapsed. And the only change really, I think, has been a deepening of the sickness that people feel here, a deepening of the fear, because as we can see with the smoke still billowing out of the World Trade Center and the horror that lies underneath that rubble, people are very frightened about what is going to be found there, because we still have no idea of fatalities. On casualties, we know 600 people are in the city's hospitals and 1,500 more are being treated at a tent hospital set up in Liberty Island Park out in the Bay of New York. But still, no way of coming to terms with something like this.
Are the rescue services at work on the site, on the rubble of those two huge buildings, or is it a place it's impossible to conceive anybody could remain alive underneath?
It's hard to know, because behind me, where the Twin Towers are, just beyond that, the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, has actually closed down the majority of the city. He's just forced a line, and everyone else has been evacuated out. We see behind us regularly coming ambulances, sirens wailing of people. We really have no idea who's being taken from the scene. But of course rescue efforts are still going on. But when you think of 110 stories, 2 towers falling down, it's a huge area area that will have been devastated, very hard to get at. And of course the city, the Red Cross here, appealing for blood donors, people being treated for burns, but kind of as the downtown area, the financial area of Manhattan behind me has been closed down, in many ways so has the information network. For example, we're hearing nothing at all on fatalities. Perhaps it's too horrible for the authorities here to even contemplate yet.
Jane, thank you very much. We know perhaps slightly less about what happened in Washington at the Pentagon building. And now we join Paddy O'Connell again in New York with the latest news of what's happening there. Paddy.
I think, David, what's becoming clear is that this is not over. That is to say, if you look at the pictures of Manhattan, downtown where it happened, the mayor has evacuated part of Lower Manhattan. That will be no surprise. But if you think back a step as to why, it's because buildings remain unstable. This is the scene around the building that collapsed, but the question being asked is, what about the buildings that were standing immediately after it? Now, I don't, where I'm sitting in Midtown Manhattan, have an answer to that question, but I'm afraid this question is the one that's preoccupying us, because underneath the rubble is the answer to the question, how many people have lost their lives? We know there are displaced people. We know there are disgusted people all across this country, and here there are people trying to get home. But as I speak to you, David, we don't know the answer to the question of the scale of the human tragedy. The analysis, important as it is, will be had, but the figures on people, we just don't know.
What sort of flow of information is there? You say nothing is really known, but is everybody, is information still coming out from the World Trade Center down there?
We have an unconfirmed report of a building collapse. At times like this, you want to hear directly from the city authorities. I passed one of the major hospitals 4 hours ago. They were shouting for blood donations in the street, and about half an hour later, many of us were reporting that they were looking for blood across the city. So it's a very much of an immediate return to the most basic way of communicating in a city of this scale. People are confused as much as they are disgusted. People are dead, and people don't know about it. So there is a stoicism here. I would say we would be clinging to the word panic and forgetting that people are getting on with it, clearing it up, and angry. But equally, we are focusing in the attention now on what's under that rubble. And here, the situation on Times Square, I don't know if we can bring you, David, the picture behind me. This was full earlier of people. It's now deserted. This makes me think people are heading home. I'm concluding this because one avenue is shut behind me, 7th Avenue, but this was full of around 500 people 3 hours ago. Where have they gone? We think they've gone home, and we don't know the answer to that either.
And is there a feeling that America will be able to revenge this in some way, or indeed prevent its happening, anything like it happening again? Or are people fatalistic about it?
I think people, a shock has turned to anger already. I heard the first mention of Pearl Harbor, was from a man on the street down here. Then we spoke to a foreign policy expert, and you're surrounded by many names that will be familiar around the world, of course. But the person that we were speaking to saying, America will respond to a moment in time. This is a moment in time. It will be hard for the president to resist some kind of call for action from the world's richest democracy. The question is, of course, and it's not for me to answer what action that will be, but yes, the word on the street from people I've spoken to is they do want action.
Paddy O'Connell, thank you very much indeed for that report. Well, there have been comparisons between today's events and the impact on the United States of Japan's surprise attack at Pearl Harbor in World War II. We've heard that said several times during this program. The difference is that then there was an enemy. To suffer the shock without knowing who's responsible or how to retaliate creates confusion and panic, which is exactly what the perpetrators of this atrocity intended. September the 11th, 2001, will be remembered as an attack not just on the United States, but on the very concept of a secure and orderly world, an attack on all of us. Coverage continues now on BBC News 24 with my colleagues Carrie Gracie and Gavin Esler.
There's another one. I'm taking a look. Oh! United States under attack. 3 hijacked planes crash into the heart of American power. 2 rip through the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. The devastation after both towers collapse, the extent of casualties is still unclear. Then, Washington, another plane crashes into a defense building at the Pentagon. Welcome to BBC World News. I'm Philip Hayton. Daniel Plesch for the moment, thank you very much. Now let's go to New York and our correspondent Steve Evans. Steve, I know you were in the World Trade Center when all this happened. Just explain to us, would you, what you saw and heard?
It's more what I felt, really. I was at the base of the second tower, if you like, the second tower that was hit on a busy, obviously a busy morning. If you wanted to choose timing, that would be the time to do it, 9:15, in a complex of buildings where 50,000 people work. There was an explosion. I didn't think it was an explosion, but the base of the building shook. I felt it shake. I thought, well, that can't be right. It felt like a big weight, a construction weight, falling from a great, great height. People moved out very, very calmly, no screaming or anything like that, but you could see moisture on their eyes and you could hear fear you could hear the fear in their voices. And then when we were outside, the second explosion happened, and there were then a series of explosions. You can see these pictures. The thing that strikes me about these pictures is that some of those emergency vehicles were clearly there when later debris rained on them. So one of the things that happened was basically the structure, the engineering, if you like, of the structure wasn't apparent to the security forces. We are now, what are we, 8 hours after that. The operation goes on. We can only wonder at the kind of damage, the kind of human damage which was caused by those explosions, those series of explosions.
How long after the attacks by the planes did the buildings actually collapse? And what happened in that intervening period?
The buildings eventually collapsed, but they collapsed about 2 hours later. There was an explosion when the aircraft hit one of the towers, and then another explosion about, I don't know, 10 minutes later when a second aircraft hit the second tower. But the building then collapsed about 2 hours later. What we're now getting is, this city is now eerie. The avenue behind me in Midtown has been closed off. People are shocked. I know it's a kind of a cliche that people say this about these kind of things, if you can imagine this kind of thing. But people are literally stunned, speechless by this whole thing. People are digesting it. There may well be some kind of appetite for revenge. The television programs are using captions like "America under attack." That word Pearl Harbor keeps cropping up. The president's statement says, "The resolve of our great nation is being tested. Make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test." The mood is, as I say, stunned into silence. There are some angry people about. There was a bit of what we British call the Dunkirk spirit. People literally out in the street calling for the public to give blood. It's a very mixed emotion.
Stephen Evans in New York, thank you very much. Well, let's try and gauge Arab reaction now. We're joined on the line by our correspondent Frank Gardner from Cairo.
You and I might think that, but some people don't look at the world in that way. If people say the only thing that works is force, that works in both directions.
We'll leave it there for the moment. We've got some news just coming in, actually, that the Salomon Brothers building in New York, right in the heart of Manhattan, has also collapsed. This does fit in with a warning from the British Foreign Office a couple of hours ago to British citizens that there is a real risk. Let me get the exact words. The British Foreign Office, the Foreign Department of the British government, said there was a strong risk of further atrocities in the United States. And it does seem as if there now is another one with the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. We've got no word yet on casualties, one assumes that the building would have been virtually deserted. Whether this latest collapse is going to influence the president, who we heard about a few moments ago, was expected to be heading from Nebraska back to Washington, we don't know. Dan Plesch, what do you think this is going to do to that crucial equation between, on the one hand, freedom, and on the other hand, security? The balance is going to change, I would guess, radically in the United States after this.
Americans pride themselves on their freedom, but I think we will see a real crackdown on the security front, particularly for access and traveling around in America on domestic airlines, which notoriously have been very, very open.
What will this do to the American psyche? You know them well, you've lived there.
I think the idea that the Americans will just retreat into themselves is nonsense. That was the Japanese hope when they attacked Pearl Harbor. But of course the Americans responded massively to that. America, I think, will engage the world. We have to see whether they do it strongly.
Dan Plesch for the moment, thank you.
There's another one. I'm taking a look.
Oh! Oh my God! Oh, Jesus! Oh my God! My own eyes. Must be. Oh my God!
The United States under attack. 3 hijacked planes crash into the heart of American power. 2 rip through the twin towers of the World Trade Center. The devastation after both towers collapse, the extent of casualties is still unclear. Then in Washington, another plane crashes into a defense building at the Pentagon. Welcome to BBC World News. I'm Philip Hayton. Heavy loss of life and catastrophic destruction. That's the scene on the streets of New York after the United States suffers what many are saying is the worst attack on the country since Pearl Harbor. A huge operation is underway to find survivors from the wreckage of both towers of the World Trade Center in New York. They collapsed after hijacked airliners with passengers on board were flown into them. The 47-story Salomon Brothers building, situated very close to the World Trade Center, has also just collapsed. And part of the Defense Department, the Pentagon near Washington, continues to burn after another hijacked airliner plunged into it. The mayor of New York has said the casualties will be more than any of us can bear. There are no indications so far of who's behind the attacks. President Bush said those responsible would be hunted down. Our correspondent Mike Wooldridge has been following the day's events.
America's vulnerability to terrorism has never been exposed like this. The second hijacked plane flies into one of the twin towers of the World Trade Center and a fireball erupts around the 110-story building. The other tower was already ablaze after being hit by another plane only minutes earlier.
Oh my God!
One plane and one tower might just have been a terrible accident. That possibility was blown apart with the second direct hit. New Yorkers assumed they were reliving the 1993 bombing of this, one of the most famous landmarks of the capitalist world, but this was to be infinitely more audacious. Some of those trapped inside went to desperate lengths in the hope of rescue. The same desperation led others to jump to an inevitable death. There was pandemonium and panic in the streets around the Trade Center as the authorities tried to marshal people away from the area.
What's happening? What's happening? It's gonna come
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
Within the hour, one of the huge towers constructed to withstand all but the most apocalyptic of events collapsed.
Thanks very much. Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
The attack was too devastating for the second tower as well, and not long after it too collapsed, filling the streets with yet more debris and dust. Thousands worked in these towers. No one had any idea how many casualties there were, but that they were mounting horrifically was obvious. The mayor of New York predicted that the death toll would be tremendous and ordered the evacuation of South Manhattan. Its streets took on an eerie appearance now as stunned people tried to make their way to safety. But the terrorists, it seems, had other designs. The very heart of the US defense establishment was another of their targets. A third hijacked plane came down in a steep descent over Washington and crashed into the side of the Pentagon, setting off another huge blaze. Apparently the evacuation of the building had been ordered a few minutes before, but had barely started. A fourth airliner came down in Pennsylvania, some 80 miles from Pittsburgh. This was the scene at the aftermath of that crash. By now, Americans were starting to portray it as the worst attack on their country since Pearl Harbor.
Once again, we see terrorism. We see terrorists, people who don't believe in democracy, people who believe that with the destruction of buildings, with the murder of people, they can somehow achieve a political purpose. They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy.
In the space of a few hours, the landscape of New York had been changed in an apparently coordinated attack that could barely have been imagined. The symbols of the devastation were as powerful as the devastation itself. Mike Wooldridge, BBC News.
Reaction to the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon have come from leaders around the world. Geeta Gurumurthy has this report.
Housing one of America's key enemies, the Taliban regime has denied Osama bin Laden was the man behind today's horrific events. The Taliban ambassador to Pakistan condemned what he called the terrorist attacks and said they don't allow bin Laden to use the asylum of Afghanistan against any country. If it's not bin Laden, there's speculation it could be a new deadly mix of disaffected Islamic groups. Today, the UN Secretary General said the world is traumatized.
There can be no doubt that these attacks are deliberate acts of terrorism, carefully planned and coordinated. And as such, I condemn them utterly. Terrorism must be fought resolutely wherever it appears. In such moments, cool and reasoned judgment are more essential than ever.
From the Middle East to Asia and Europe, world leaders have joined in condemnation. The Russian President Vladimir Putin said his people felt the pain of the Americans.
Сегодня Соединенные Штаты Америки
He said today had proved the need for Russian plans for an international fight against terrorism. Britain too joined in the call for mass condemnation against an attack of mass terrorism.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism.
NATO called an emergency meeting. Armed forces are on alert, but it's still not known who carried out this atrocity.
The Americans don't know, we don't know, but the clear message to whoever it was is that they will have left a trail behind them, and they can be assured that they will be found. And the international community, the whole international community, will be united in condemning what they've done and making sure that they're not in a position to do it again.
Governments everywhere are dazed by the destruction. From Iran, Syria, China, Ghana, words of condemnation. And from Cuba and South Africa, offers of humanitarian aid. And whilst the Bush administration may have incurred increasing wrath, especially in the Muslim world, the question remains, if America is this vulnerable, is anyone safe? Geeta Gurumurthy, BBC News.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened. during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost a sense downtown in New York behind me, down by the World Trade Centers, of just an area completely closed off as the rescue workers try to do their job. But this isn't the first building that has suffered as a result. We know that part of the Marriott Hotel next to the World Trade Center also collapsed as a result of this huge amount of falling debris from 110 floors of the two twin towers of the World Trade Center. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash, and we know that behind that there's an empty piece of what was a very familiar New York skyline, a symbol of the financial prosperity of this city, but completely disappeared now, and New York is still unable to take on board what has happened to them today.
Presumably there were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
That's what you would hope, because this whole downtown area behind me has been completely sealed off and evacuated, apart from the emergency workers. That was done by the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, much earlier today, because of course, the dreadful collapse of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. But New York, very much a city still in chaos. The phones are not working properly, the subway lines are not working properly. And we know that down there near the World Trade Center, there are 3 schools that are being turned into triage centers for emergency treatment. And I know that over in New York Harbor, where the famous Statue of Liberty is, there's a field hospital where 1,500 people are being treated. And we have heard, though it's unconfirmed as yet, that 100 New York City police officers have been taken there as well for treatment. But we do need to confirm those figures for the officers.
It's now, what, some 8 hours since the attacks. Is there any estimate yet available of the number of casualties in the World Trade Center?
I think we can only go at this point with the words expressed by the mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, that it's too frightening to think how many there could be. We know that it's about almost 300 people on the airliners that were used in these attacks. But you've got to remember, this was 9 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday morning. It's busy in downtown Manhattan, in the financial district then. The World Trade Center itself has 50,000 workers. There are tens of thousands of tourists who go up there every day. The figures are almost too frightening to contemplate. You can understand why nobody yet wants to put a figure on them.
Listening to the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, a bit earlier, one of his messages was, business as usual. We won't let this get us down. But presumably, a lot of Manhattan people must have fled the city to Long Island to get away from possible further attacks.
Well, a lot of people were certainly trying to, but you remember that very early on, all the bridges and tunnels to the city, as well as the airports, were closed. New York was sealed, essentially. Now, we do know that the Long Island Railroad has begun running again to get people out of the city if they can, and people who can't manage to get out and perhaps lived in that area, they're being offered accommodation in empty school buildings. But certainly I saw earlier on today huge crowds of people desperately trying to walk up upper Manhattan to get as far away as possible. I think nobody really knows how to go or where to go, and you have to remember, even now, I don't think people can sink in to people what's happened.
We haven't for the past hour or so heard much from the people of Manhattan. You're with them there. I mean, what are they saying tonight after this catastrophic attack?
As I said, many just cannot believe this has happened, and I've seen big burly men and women with tears in their eyes today, shaking their heads, wondering what on earth is going on. There was a sense of panic. Our reports from the scene were of people just absolutely horrified. And I've already seen some photographs of that a man took down in the downtown area, and it looks like the aftermath of a huge atom bomb or something, just full of debris and of like a white carpeting of snow from all the dust and rubbish that had fallen. I don't think people can comprehend. They certainly have lost any feeling of safety. There's still a great pride in the city. People are determined to fight back, but a great sense of shock and loss. People keep looking at the sky, for example, where you can see the plume of smoke and say, when that's gone, it won't be there anymore. Our Twin Towers won't be there. Such a symbol of New York.
Are they talking yet about revenge and what the government should do to counter this threat, or are they numbed still?
I think people are still numb, and I don't think people are talking about revenge in that way at all yet. I think people are still too traumatized. We don't know how many people have been killed. We can't even put a figure. I think when you talk to people on they daren't even say how many people might have been killed and injured, and I think that feeling, until idea of the devastation, people don't really know what to say or what to think. I think they feel the bubble of their security as being in America has definitely been popped. This city and this country will not be the same, but they don't really know where to turn. That's the very sad thing. I think there's going to be a lot of very, very traumatized people that has hit them very, very hard.
Jane, I think many of us, when we heard the news, perhaps on the radio earlier today, were completely flabbergasted by it and just couldn't comprehend it. I mean, it almost sounded too far-fetched. I was wondering what it felt like for you being in Manhattan. Well, unfortunately, I think we've lost the line with Jane Stanley in Manhattan. Perhaps we can rejoin her and follow that up later. Across America, citizens are trying to come to grips with the enormity of what has happened. As our correspondent Tom Carver reports, it'll be days before the country returns to anything resembling normal life. Now, if you're just joining us, let's recap on today's catastrophic events. There's been a heavy loss of life and destruction. That's the scene on the streets of New York after the United States suffers what many are saying is the worst attack on the country since Pearl Harbor back in the Second World War. A huge operation is underway to find survivors from the wreckage of both towers of the World Trade Center in New York. They collapsed after hijacked airliners with passengers on board were flown into them. The 47-story Salomon Brothers building, situated very close to the World Trade Center, has also collapsed. And part of the Defense Department, the Pentagon, near Washington, continues to burn after another hijacked airliner plunged into it. The mayor of New York has said the casualties will be more than any of us can bear.
Hours after the attacks, the United States, the whole world, is struggling to take it all in. There's really no more rescue the firemen can seriously attempt. It's now a question of salvage amid the wreckage, as others in New York try to establish how many men, women and children have been lost. A priest picks his way through the New York ruins. The World Trade Center has been reduced to the stumps of skyscrapers that once helped define one of the world's most vibrant cities, normally loud with life. An entire society feels itself violated by terror. James Robbins, BBC News.
We've just got some pictures in from New York of the latest building to collapse. That's the Salomon Brothers building. That's 47 stories tall. There you can see it going. So this happened, some 6 hours or so after the collapse of the World Trade Center. Presumably, it was so close to the World Trade Center that it had been weakened by the explosions and the collapse of those buildings. We were talking to our correspondent in New York a few moments ago, trying to find out what sort of casualties might be involved in the collapse of this building, but it's just in the realm of guesswork. Most people, it's assumed, had been evacuated from the building, and perhaps there'd only be a skeleton staff there. Presumably, they would recognize the risk of it collapsing in the wake of the World Trade Center. I'm joined now by a terrorism and Middle East expert, Dr. Kirsten Schultz from the London School of Economics. So we're all trying to make sense of this, trying to work out who and what might be behind it all. Most fingers seem to point to the Middle East. Several prominent groups there, as you probably know, have denied responsibility. But I think most fingers are pointing at Osama bin Laden. We just heard from our correspondent in Islamabad. Is that the way your mind is thinking?
Well, I think if we look at the various groups and see what resources they have and what capability and international connections, we can rule out some of the smaller groups. And Osama bin Laden does fit the profile, even if at the moment there is no concrete evidence in that direction.
I suppose we must keep an open mind because we've got so little evidence to go on.
Oh, definitely, especially bearing in mind Oklahoma. We had a bombing there. The first suspects were Middle Easterners, and it turned out to be an American.
One assumes that Saddam Hussein would like to perpetrate an attack like this.
I think there are many people who would like to perpetrate an attack like that. The US is not particularly popular if we look at the Middle East.
Welcome to BBC World News. I'm Philip Hayton. Heavy loss of life and catastrophic destruction. That's the scene on the streets of New York after the United States suffers what many are saying is the worst attack on the country since Pearl Harbor. A huge operation is underway to find survivors from the wreckage of both towers of the World Trade Center in New York. They collapsed after hijacked airliners with passengers on board were flown into them. The 47-story Salomon Brothers building, situated very close to the World Trade Center, has also collapsed. And part of the Defense Department, the Pentagon near Washington, continues to burn from another hijacked airliner plunging into it. The mayor of New York has said the casualties will be more than any of us can bear. We're getting pictures all the time coming in from New York. I imagine many of them taken by amateurs. These are the latest of the attack by an airliner on the World Trade Center in New York. The stuff of movies. It's hard to believe, isn't it, that this actually happened about 10 hours ago. Not just one plane, but two planes. There was the second explosion. And those two explosions, of course, eventually forced the two towers to collapse about an hour and a half later as people were being evacuated from the building. And then this evening, a third building in New York has collapsed, the Salomon Brothers building. There it goes, 47 stories. That was presumably weakened by the collapse of the World Trade Center only a few blocks away earlier today. And now let's go back to New York and look at some pictures just in showing the Trade Center collapsing. Pictures keep coming in despite it being, almost 10 hours now since the original attack. This is because various footage, many of it from amateurs, is being released to the television stations. And in fact, that is not the World Trade Center. I got some wrong information there. It is the Salomon Brothers building. So that is this evening in New York. It collapsed some 6 hours after the World Trade Center, presumably weakened by the collapse of the World Trade Center just a few blocks away from it. We heard from our correspondent earlier that much of Manhattan is quiet, not many people around. So all being well, the casualty toll in that building should not be very high. But of course there were presumably security and other officials around the building when it did collapse. Worldwide condemnation of the attacks has been swift.
Well, in New York, the rescue effort is really just getting underway after the collapse of not just the World Trade Center's twin towers, but also the 47-story Salomon building next door to it. For the latest, we can go now to New York and join our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, bring us up to date, if you can, on what's happening now.
Well, we still have no further concrete word on casualty figures, as you said, though people are expecting very horrific numbers. But just down behind me, where the World Trade Center towers used to be, we can still see a thick plume of smoke and of ash in the air, and queues of rescue vehicles, heavy lifting gear being brought in, reinforcements of police in buses and cars, ambulances, all the emergency services getting in. And we know that the mayor of the city, Rudolph Giuliani, and the governor of New York have been appealing for any medical staff in the area to come here to help out, because we've already seen several thousand people being treated in a tent hospital out in New York Bay, and we know that some of those are New York City police officers. We think about 100, and we have unconfirmed as yet reports that as many as 200 firefighters may have been killed and 70 police officers are missing. They were emergency personnel around the building when the towers fell down. So New York in a state of panic and of great grief.
After the collapse of the Solomon building, Jane, are the other buildings in that area stable? Hello, Jane?
Nada.
No, I think we've lost Jane Stanley in New York. We'll try and get back to her later. Deborah.
And now a summary of the main news on BBC News.
But what they will really be listening for and what they will have been gladdened about was the words such as the American economy will be open for business tomorrow, the federal government will go back to work, and American way of life will continue.
He said also, Tom, as you mentioned, that the search is already underway for those responsible. On the other hand, the FBI in Washington, presumably its headquarters, were among the buildings which were evacuated today.
That's right. Every single federal building in this town was evacuated, including the FBI, including obviously the Pentagon, where there was one of these plane crashes, including Congress. And so really for most of today, this has been a town pretty much without a government. George Bush only came back here in the last hour or so. Having said that, though, clearly the government does continue. There's no question of who is in control in America tonight. And that's what he wanted to get across, that image of the president sitting there calmly in the Oval Office, at home, back in Washington, not underneath the ground in some nuclear bunker, and capable of continuing business tomorrow.
Is there, as yet though, Tom, any hard, direct evidence which points to any group in the Middle East as being chief suspects behind this outrage?
Well, if there is, I'm not party to it, Bill. I mean, there may well be some very strong evidence out there. We know that the FBI gets many calls and alerts during the time, which never in fact surface publicly, about possible terrorist attacks, which they then manage to either prevent happening or dismantle the terrorist organization. Often these things are never made public, because to do that would be to compromise further activities. And so I think it's very difficult to know what sort of evidence there is out there. All I can say, however, is that a formal member of this government has come out and said we hold anyone responsible for this. They're not even saying where they think it might come from. But unofficially, everyone is talking about Osama bin Laden as being the only group, really, the only man and the only organization capable of carrying out such a complex series of terrorist activities simultaneously.
Tom Carver in Washington for the moment, thank you very much. In the studio with us again is Dr. Martin Navius, a defense and security analyst. So the hunt, President Bush said, is already on for the people responsible. Where do they begin?
Well, firstly, you asked the question of your correspondent, is there hard evidence? The problem here is that you will never find that kind of hard evidence. Up until now, the United States has often taken a quasi-legalistic approach to hunting down terrorists. You may remember after the attack on the US Navy ship off Yemen, they sent in the FBI agents, they look for evidence, they try and build up a case, bring them to trial. This is a very difficult approach when coming to deal with terrorists, because the terrorists do not leave a trail that is easily recognizable. So the United States has a second option. It can say, well, we identify various terrorist organizations in the Middle East and elsewhere who are responsible for these kind of acts. Osama bin Laden is one of those, and we will go after them whether or not we have direct evidence of that organization's link to this outrage or not. And then the United States will be faced with a decision: does it only go after Osama bin Laden, or does it widen this into a war against international terrorism, which would involve attacking more groups than Osama bin Laden? The third and final question that the Americans are going to ask themselves, and which Mr. Bush hinted at, is whether they are going to go after the states that support the terrorists, that provide them with the infrastructure and the base in which to act.
It certainly appeared he was widening the net there when he said no distinction would be made between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them. And as Tom Carver mentioned, that includes a whole range of countries.
That includes a whole range of countries, but within that range of countries, some are easier targets than others. You may recall that President Clinton launched various missile attacks at Afghanistan and Sudan following the terrorist attacks on the embassies in East Africa. And it's possible that they will do this again. But there are another range of countries which were mentioned by Mr. Pearl earlier in your broadcasts. He mentioned countries such as Iraq, Iran and Syria. Now, if the United States wishes to go after these countries, well, then we are looking at a different order of problem, because these countries can fight back, unlike Afghanistan and Sudan. The question becomes then is how far the United States is prepared to take that, and I think a lot of that has to do with the casualties, the size, the scale and scope of the casualties that will emerge from this outrage.
Is there any likelihood at all that this could have been a domestic terrorist incident, as was Oklahoma?
It may be, and that changes the equation entirely. I don't think it is. There's no real indication. The suicide element, the sophistication of the attack. But even let us assume, for sake of argument, that it wasn't a domestic, a lunatic brigade. I still think that this outrage was so significant, the consequences are so great, that it will shift the domestic focus, the domestic sensitivity to terrorism, such that the United States will have to take a far more aggressive policy, will have to adopt a far more aggressive policy towards terrorists, whether they are domestic or international.
And if the United States decides to take some form of reprisal action, how long would it be? We had a scare already in the past couple of hours when there were explosions in Kabul, and it turned out to be some local military action between the government there and rebel forces. But how long would it be before cruise missiles start?
Well, there are two types of operations. There are operations undertaken by governments to show that they are doing something, to slake the thirst for revenge amongst the domestic population, to show that they are in control of events and that they are punishing the enemy.
The Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon has said behind terrorist attacks will have nowhere to hide. Suspicion has fallen on Islamic militant groups, including those associated with the Saudi exile Osama bin Laden, already wanted by the Americans. The Taliban authorities in Afghanistan, where Mr. bin Laden is based, say he didn't have the capability for such a huge operation. Many world governments have ordered defense alerts and called emergency security meetings. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin spoke of inhuman attacks. The British Prime Minister Tony Blair spoke of a battle between the democratic world and terrorism.
Well, as Deborah mentioned there, in the Middle East, the unprecedented terrorist attack has been condemned by both Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. Many other questions to come, of course, Chris, especially how this could have happened. How could the airport security have been so poor as to allow 4 hijacks in one day? And how is it that American intelligence failed so badly?
Yes, I think that is probably, from the point of view of the immediate situation, that is the big criticism. It seems that the hijacks were carried out with knives. We had a couple of cell phone calls being made by one of the passengers unfortunate enough to have been on one of the aircraft. She made that call to her husband, saying that the attackers were armed with knives, in some cases stabbing flight attendants as they took over the planes, and then of course taking over the controls themselves and flying into the various locations. I think that is a big criticism. As far as the fact that the planes were able to fly over New York so low, I mean, I haven't heard quite so much criticism about that. I think the broader criticism is simply that the United States has allowed what are called these terrorist networks to carry on flourishing. We have an article by Henry Kissinger in the Washington Post, which is coming out just about now, saying that it's time to go after the global terrorist networks that threaten the United States. We also have an article by Jim Hoagland, a prominent commentator, saying that there has been a certain complacency in the repeated assurances from officials in both the Clinton and Bush administrations that US power has put its openly declared enemies abroad in a box from which they were powerless to strike convincingly at US interests. In other words, he's more or less saying that the intelligence services haven't done their job, not just in preventing this particular attack, but in dealing with the whole network of organizations and indeed governments which lie behind it.
Chris Feach in Washington, thank you.
This is BBC News now, a summary. President George Bush has acknowledged that thousands of people were killed in the series of attacks.
And will American retribution, is there any guarantee that American retribution will be directed at the right target?
Well, the Americans will have difficulty finding definitive evidence linking Osama bin Laden, if that is their main target, to the terrorist assault. But what we are seeing indications of this evening is that Americans are more interested in a broader assault on international terror, that is, going after the causes and supporters of the terror movement. This will be a long and drawn-out and bloody struggle in which there will be many casualties. It won't take place immediately, but it will take place over the next few months and years.
People will be asking in the United States, though, how on earth this could have happened. How could you have a situation where 4 aircraft are hijacked in such a short space of time?
Well, no doubt the planning of this operation took many months, if not years. It reflects a sophisticated terrorist group that is well versed in these kind of operations.
Live to New York now, we can join Patrick O'Connell, our correspondent there. Patrick, night has fallen in New York. Has the full horror, has the enormity of this awful tragedy sunk in?
No, I don't think it has. The events of yesterday were terrifying. In many respects, I think what's more terrifying lies ahead. If you take a look behind me down here, this is where the World Trade Center was. And it's under this rubble that are lying injured people we know, and of course dead people whose numbers we don't know. And this is what's going to be coming out in the next few hours. Horrifying details of people's lives. All over this city are people who can't reach people. They're confused. They've been trying all day. And the details will be emerging as a result of the work that's going on now.
So those search and rescue efforts, Paddy, are obviously continuing. They must be hampered, surely, by the fear that what remains of those buildings are still very, very unstable and are likely to tumble down.
That is definitely what's happened. It was hampered in the early hours, and it's being hampered now, but it is not being halted. The work is going on, but you'll know from the collapse of the 3rd building and the evacuation of the lower part of Manhattan that the risk of unstable structures of secondary explosions and fires has remained and still remains. The mayor has told the city that the work will go on but has been hampered, and that's exactly what's happened. You have to remember that there are many firefighters and police officers who've lost their lives because they arrived on the scene and events enfolded and engulfed them too. So there is the maximum caution given that that loss of life happened after the incident first began what seems like a very long time ago.
Patrick, there are some encouraging reports, aren't there, of life being in the basement of the World Trade Center in one or both of those buildings?
These are reports that I have not heard, and I'm afraid to tell you that much of the attention is focusing on the loss of life. As the emergency services get closer, we will hopefully find stories of people who are surviving there now and who will be rescued and recovered. But unfortunately, it's the overwhelming nature of the loss of life which is gripping most New Yorkers, quite apart from the international questions of politics and of international responses. which are being talked about in many other parts of the world.
Finally, Patrick, we've just seen Mayor Giuliani giving the impression of life continuing as normal. Presumably this is an attempt to shore up people's sensibilities, to try to establish that nobody has really been completely and utterly wrecked by this and that life will continue. Obviously, with a certain amount of difference, north of 14th Street is open for business.
Well, it's very reduced business. People whose job is not essential are being urged not to come to work. Schools are closed. Airports are closed. The stock exchanges are closed. It's a very, very different New York. The skyline's scarred, and so has the way of life been. The mayor has said the city will rebuild, but it seems to me right now the job is finding people who are still alive.
Patrick, thank you for that update.
Rescue efforts are continuing in Washington.
World Trade Center number 1 is the first one to be hit, 8:46, 9:03 South Tower hit, 9:59 South Tower collapse, 10:28 North Tower collapse, and then for the average TV person, the show is over.
It is 5 o'clock on this Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, a day we'll never forget in New York's history, in this nation's history.
So much going on, of course. So we have our reporters out on the field. Vince Dementri is joining us right now. He is live in Lower Manhattan with an update as to what's happening there at the moment. Vince?
I can tell you I've just been a place that I have been to that, frankly, no firefighters want to go to. Behind me, you see burning 7 World Trade Center. I didn't know it at the beginning, at the tape you're about to see. I didn't know it was a 7 World Trade Center, but I know it now coming back. A 4-block radius has been cordoned off because fire officials expect that building to collapse. I've been within 10 feet of that building within the last 15 minutes. I've been as close to where no one wants to be. Take a look. Behind me, that gaping hole, that's where one of the 2 towers stood. It's not there. And as you can see above me, the fire in this adjacent building just continues to rage. It's a surreal environment.
Wenn Sie jetzt nach New York gehen und Sie gehen zum Ground Zero, dann gibt es dort 2 große, tiefe Löcher. Und das heißt, das 9/11 Memorial lenkt die Aufmerksamkeit der Besucher auf die Twin Towers, dass die nicht mehr da sind. Dass das WTC 7 nicht mehr da ist, das finden Sie nicht heraus. Da gibt es kein Loch. Also auch hier, man hätte 3 Löcher machen müssen. Aber macht man natürlich nicht. Und das Memorial besteht aus 2 großen Löchern im Boden in New York. Das heißt, die Leute, die das Memorial anschauen, denken wieder, es sind 2 Türme. Es gibt nicht 3 Löcher, weil eigentlich müsste es 3 Löcher haben. Es sind nämlich 3 zusammengestürzt. Das heißt, auch Gedenkstätten können die Verwirrung vertiefen, indem sie die Gedanken der Menschen lenken. Kein Hinweis auf WTC 7. Keiner. Ist für mich jetzt nichts Neues. Man hat immer wieder eigentlich die Menschen getäuscht.
Die Gedenkstätte zu den Terroranschlägen, wenn man da hingeht, sind nur 2 Löcher. Es wird eben nicht auf das WTC 7 hingewiesen, sondern das sind jetzt nur die Löcher von den Twin Towers. Und dazwischen gibt es dieses Museum und das WTC 7 gibt es nicht. Es gibt es einfach nicht. Es ist aus der Erinnerung ausgelöscht. Und ja, das ist eigentlich der Versuch, die Geschichtsschreibung zu manipulieren.
And the memorial focuses the attention of people on the Twin Towers because there's huge gaps. It doesn't focus you on World Trade Center 7. In fact, if you go to New York today, you'd never think that 3 towers collapsed because the history, as it's in the memorial, is 2. Okay, that's the official history. And a good friend of mine who's seen my talks on World Trade Center 7 has written me, "Gee, Dan, I've just been to New York. This is crazy. If you're there, it's all full of the Twin Towers, nothing on World Trade Center 7. You know, They should, of course, have the video of World Trade Center 7 on the billboard right there, and it's coming down all the time. That would give a whole different sense to the whole memorial site. Wenn Sie die Memorial-Städte besuchen in New York, dann sehen Sie, da gibt es hier große, das sind eigentlich die Fußstapfen, wo die Twin Towers standen. Das heißt, Ihre Achtsamkeit wird auf die Twin Towers gelenkt. Gibt es auch so ein Loch beim WTC 7? Nein. Hat das einen Einfluss? Ja. Denken Sie mal, da wäre nichts, kein Memorial. Und die ganze Memorial-Sache wäre bei WTC 7. Riesenloch, die Leute müssen darüber nachdenken, da würde groß stehen, wurde nie vom Flugzeug getroffen, aber ist auch eingestürzt.
Bells tolling at 8:46 and 9:03. The moment when terrorists attacked the World Trade Center 22 years ago.
Alvin Peter Kappelman Jr.
Then the emotional reading of nearly 3,000 names of those who died that day.
And my poppy, Gerard Patrick Frank, firefighter from Rescue Company 3. I miss you and love you. I wish you got to take me fishing. We love you, Poppy.
Pain for lost family members, both fresh and lingering.
I just hope you're proud of who I've grown up to be. Thank you for loving us, Dad, and thank you for being my dad.
Tonight, a nation honoring a promise to never forget. Rahima Ellis, NBC News, New York.